As I mentioned, I'm the CEO of Sharity. We are an international consulting firm. Right now, we have about 25 on our team, people from literally all over the globe. We work in 33 different countries, working on a variety of issues from gender-based violence to homelessness, human trafficking, poverty, hunger, and even the environment. Our specialty is helping organizations scale and grow. Some of the countries that we work with, we're really excited to be working again this year and next year with UN Women throughout the Caribbean. And we've had a wonderful opportunity to work with organizations like NNEDV and the YWCA USA. We work to help you grow and scale. That's our specialty. It's going in and making sure that you have a strong business plan, but also that you have the infrastructure and the components that you need, including the fundraising strategy, to be able to scale your organization and make sure that you have sustainable revenue for the long term. So with that, I just want to share a little bit about what's coming up in November. This will be the final in our three-part series for 2024. We're going to be talking about myth busting. This month, we're focusing on domestic violence because it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And next month, we're actually going to be taking and wrapping all three of our webinar series together. So how do we engage the voices of those with lived experience? Today, talking about how do we really break down barriers and think about how we're providing those services and how we might be actually keeping people out of being successful. And then finally, talking to some amazing people who have taken on those big myths around homelessness and have solved the problem and actually implemented the programs that people said couldn't be, and solved problems that people said couldn't be solved.
So if we don't hear from you before 6 p.m.
And make sure you're muted. So that will be coming up in November. And as you mentioned, you're already signed up for that. So you don't have to do anything. You're pre-registered. And if you aren't able to make it, you'll get the recording. So I encourage you to listen to the first one, and then we'll send the recording of this one as well. In 2025, we're going to have another really amazing series, one focused on founder syndrome and how do you make sure that you have a successful CEO founder transition, especially when the CEO has been there, either a founder or been there for over 10 years. We're going to be talking about the unspoken crisis that we're seeing in the nonprofit sector around senior leadership health. We're seeing a lot of our senior leaders with clients end up in hospitals with pretty serious health conditions because of burnout. And then talking about how do you balance fear and all the other things that you have to do. So with that, I'm going to introduce our amazing speakers for today who are here to talk about access for everyone. How do we really rethink and break down barriers? So first, I'm going to start with talking, letting them each introduce themselves. I'm going to actually go alphabetically. I want to have first Josh, if you don't mind going ahead and introducing yourself. Oh, you're muted, Josh.
I am. There's always one, right? Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Josh Hanson. I'm the Executive Director at the SAFE Center, which is a multi-service agency here on Long Island, providing sort of comprehensive and wraparound services for victims and survivors of domestic and intimate partner violence, rape and sexual assault, child physical and sexual abuse, and human trafficking. It's good to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Josh. Allie.
Hi, everyone. Allie Phillips here. I am the founder and CEO of Sheltering Animals and Families Together, called the Safety Program. And we are a global initiative helping domestic violence shelters to create on-site pet housing. And we launched and have been leading the pet-inclusive domestic violence shelter movement since at least 2008 when the first written guidelines came out. Glad to be here.
And Ashley.
Yes, so I am Ashley Rumschlag, and I am the National Director of DomesticShelters.org, which is now a program of Alliance for Hope International. DomesticShelters.org is an online resource that provides information about domestic violence for those over 10 million people every month who are searching online for domestic violence help. So each year, about 3 million of those people find domesticshelters.org. We also support domestic shelters professionals through fundraising tools, educational opportunities, and Purple Ribbon Awards. And just very quickly about Alliance for Hope, they run the Family Justice Center Alliance, the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, Camp Help America, and the Justice Project.
Thank you so much, Ashley. So we're going to start off today, and if people want to be able to see the speaker a little bit more clearly, you can change it up your view to speaker view, and that might make it a little bit easier to watch the panel. I want to start off today and just talk about a few statistics that we hear all the time, because we're trying to talk about making sure that survivors get the services that they need and that they result in the outcomes that survivors are looking for. And one of the things that Sharity has done in the past is some research and asking domestic violence shelters in particular across the Americas, how do you measure impact? And most measure it in what we call outputs, which is how many bed nights or how many counseling sessions, which really does not tell us anything about whether or not we're doing anything helpful for that survivor. So I want all of you out there listening, how many of you have heard the statistic that it takes 7 times for a woman to be able to leave before she finally successfully leaves her abuser? Probably quite a few of you. Yeah, a lot of people are raising their hands. Well, believe it or not, when you go out and you try to find the base research for that statistic, it doesn't exist. In fact, we actually went to one of the women who's been in the movement for a long, long time, and she said she thought it was something that somebody mentioned years ago. And in fact, when you look it up online and try to find the research, it really is a word of mouth thing. And so that statistic for me in particular, having run a DV center for 10 years, was really focused on how they were going back. They were, a lot of times they were used saying that she was addicted to her, the relationship. She had this trauma bond, all kinds of reasons. But I also think it's an excuse for why services weren't working, because they needed to go back 7 times. But if we debunk that, because there is no basis for that data, then what is that really telling us about what we're saying to women and when they do go back, what's happening and why they're going back? What we do know, the statistics that we do know, is that from last year's National Network to End Domestic Violence count, that 13,335 survivors every single day, of course they counted on one day, but every single day, are denied the service that they're asking for. A little over half of those are asking for emergency shelter and housing. So we're talking about 7,200 survivors a day are asking for housing and shelter, and they're being denied in the United States alone. So if we extrapolate, I know there's, repeated calls and things like that, but if we extrapolate that, that's 2.6 million survivors that are turned away every single year in the United States who are seeking shelter and housing alone, just shelter and house. What we also know from a study, Chandling study, and anybody who'd like copies of these studies, I'm happy to send you the links to them. But Chandling did a study, and it's one of the few studies that I have found about shelter success. And it said that 75% of survivors who go into shelter will either end up homeless or back with their abuser, which means that we're only successful with about 25% of people who come into shelter. The other thing that we know from talking to domestic violence organizations is, from homeless organizations rather, is that we often, that the number one cause of homelessness in the United States for women and girls is being a survivor of domestic violence. So if we know that a lot of times shelter is not the most successful thing for women and children, they're ending up back with their abusers or ending up on the streets homeless. The fastest growing population and the number one reason women and children are homeless on the street is because they're fleeing a violent relationship. Perhaps it's time we step back and rethink, what are we doing and how are we measuring success? So with that, I'm going to create, a conversation here with my panelists who are experts in this. And I'm going to start off with you, Ashley. Right now, NADV is doing their 2024 annual count of DV survivors. And I mentioned that, the 7,000 being turned away from shelter and seeking housing every day. You work with a lot of these shelters. And I know that you have a lot of organizations that you all are in contact with, as well as a lot of survivors that are looking at your platform for resources. What do you think about the high rates of survivors looking for shelter and then not actually being able to access it?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the obvious reasons is lack of funding, right? They're not able to accommodate everyone who reaches out because they just simply don't have the space. What this means is, so another reason is because they're using like a triage process, right? So they're saying, are you in danger right now? No. Okay, we're going to save this bed open for someone who may be coming in and is in immediate risk based on the danger assessment or whatever assessment they're using. So those who, may have capacity may be only able to help the woman, though. So if you look at someone that may have an older male child, a pet, as I know Allie's going to talk more about, in most of these cases, if they're not able to accommodate that specific need, they won't, will decide not to go to shelter because their needs are not being met. Another thing, since domesticshelters.org uses 100% online, we get to learn a lot about how people reach out for help, and how people use the website tells us this information. And what we're finding is that 83% of the people who visit domesticshelters.org aren't there to use the searchable database. They're reading articles, they're watching videos, they're browsing other resources, basically just trying to figure out and make sense of what they're experiencing. And this tells us that those people who are getting to the point where they're being captured by that NNEDV annual count likely have spent hours and hours reading and convincing themselves that reaching out for help is, the next best step. So, which just makes it even more crucial why, when they make the calls, they get the outcome of there's no help for them. They're turned away. They may never reach out for help again, as well. And one more thing is, are the services not only pets and older children, but are they addressing immigration status, disability needs, lack of transportation, HIV status, fear of being judged, and fear of racial discrimination? So there's so many different things that shelters need to keep in mind.
Well, and with that, I'm going to move over to Josh real quick. And Josh, your organization is unique in that you are the county provider for not only the Children's Advocacy Center, but you do the Rape Crisis Center, human trafficking, and you have the domestic violence shelter as well as the mental health services. And because of that, you've got a lot of different people who are coming to you with a different victim label on their, on their intake form. Can you talk a little bit about polyvictimization, what you see, and about how that sometimes can be a barrier as well?
Yeah. So I mean, the Safe Center is the product of a merge of a primarily child abuse responding agency and a primarily domestic violence, rape, and sexual assault responding agency. And the two agencies merged with the vision of creating sort of a one-stop shop for victims and survivors, and also their family members, particularly their non-offending family members. So, the merger sort of created this spectrum of services for us and started a dialogue within the context, as you said, Carol, of polyvictimization and ACEs and other things. How do we look at families both more holistically and within their context, as opposed to sort of trying to fit them into service silos or service definitions? And so, one of the conversations we've had a lot is, services are often funded, at least in New York State, based on, are you a domestic violence victim or are you a rape and sexual assault victim? But what we know is those aren't two distinct groups of people, right? There's something like 90 or 95% overlap within those groups. And so trying to separate out services based on which issue someone sees as their primary is not a great way to parse services. And so for us, what we've tried to create is a sort of no wrong door model where when clients first come to us, we're having a dialogue with them about what are their needs. And you heard Ashley talk a lot about concrete needs and things like that. We're assessing sort of comprehensively what the needs of the individual and the family are, and then trying to figure out how to match them up with services either with us or in other places. And so we assign an advocate who sort of helps them navigate the system and works as a navigator, if you will, in terms of identifying both their priorities for their needs and connecting them with the services that we provide or connecting them with services elsewhere. So an example, and a lot of our model is about how do we integrate those services more within our sort of one-stop shop setting, even if it's not us providing them. And so an example of how we've done that is we were fortunate to have a food pantry co-locate a sort of small portion of their services with us for our clients exclusively. That allowed us not to have to sort of expand and operate a food pantry, which is not our mission or expertise, but also to have that available as part of our services. And so it's available to people who come to the agency. I think what we've seen is it's really opened up a lot of opportunity for multi-service interactions with clients, as opposed to having a more rigidly defined sort of service model that, well, you come to us and you have to go into the safe home in order to access these services versus you have to come through emergency department in order to access other services. And so it's fostered this dialogue of how do we create more flexibility? How do we remove barriers to access? And how do we ensure that there is less of a return to abusers and batterers, which is a very delicate conversation because we certainly never want to shame anybody for the choices that they make, but certainly we don't ever want anybody to return to a potentially unsafe situation because we were not meeting their need. So that's sort of the core of what we do and what we're trying to provide at the Safe Center.
Great, thank you. And I think the thing that I really like about what Safe Center is doing is, it's so easy to have someone come in and identify as a rape victim through the emergency room, and then not be able to access other services that you offer because all of a sudden they're on a track and they open that door and that's the services that they get. And that's what funders like. They like to say, this is, these are the services that you provide for people who've experienced rape, people who've experienced domestic violence, whatever it might be, or even that your child has been abused, and then we overlook the fact that the person's being trafficked. So I really like that approach. Allie, your whole career is all about reducing barriers, and making sure that when people make that decision to leave, that those barriers are taken down. Do you want to talk just a little bit about why are there still so many shelters in the United States that do not allow pets?
Yeah, and I ask myself that every day. So currently, 46 states have at least one pet-friendly shelter. The states that we don't have yet are Delaware, Hawaii, Nebraska, District of Columbia, Rhode Island, although Rhode Island just received one of the Federal Paws Act OVC grants, so they are technically in progress. So, when I look at why shelters are not doing this, because globally there's about 325 shelters. So in the U.S., what that equates to is less than 15% are accommodating pets on site. And so, it ends up being a really complex set of factors on why shelters are not opening their doors to pets. And, if I can share kind of my top 5 reasons of what I've identified.
Please.
Okay, so number 1, the shelter likely doesn't have enough information to even make a decision. So they've either not come to a presentation, they've not requested what we have is the Safety Startup Manual. That is a free download to any domestic violence shelter. They can go to our website and request it. And so they may have all these ideas that it's costly, it's time consuming, and put up a lot of barriers to this. And so the solution is to get the manual, because it literally walks them through the process from start to finish. It answers all the questions. It gives them forms that they can use, and it gives them access to the safety program as a free resource. So when I hear shelters say, well, we don't have space for pets. Well, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you have to take service animals. So let's start from there as a launching pad. Or if they're thinking, well, it's going to be costly, well, you can set these programs up for free, but there are a lot of funding options. So that's kind of the first thing, is just not having all the information. The second factor is they may not really understand how animal abuse links to domestic violence. And I've actually had shelters say to me that they do not have this issue in their community, but they're not asking. And the research shows us that up to 65% of survivors are going to stay in an abusive home or delay leaving so that they can take care of their pet. And when we have 66% of homes with a pet, I do the math in my head, with 12 million victims of interpersonal violence annually, that's about 8 million pets annually that are in the pathway of domestic violence. And so their people are too. So this is a barrier. And I feel that as this movement progresses, it's going to impact a shelter's ability to get funding and to receive community support and donations, because the shelter is not serving 66% of their pet owning community. So they just don't really understand the depth of the research. Number 3, they are probably not asking their residents or the people who call into the hotline if they have pets and if their pets are in harm's way. And if they don't ask, they're not going to know what their community is dealing with. And if they do ask, they may feel overwhelmed with the information and not know what to do. And that's where we help them with resources to help in the meantime. But knowing can really change what they are doing as a shelter. The fourth factor is if a shelter has an off-site pet housing program, they are partnered with an animal shelter or have a foster care program, they might not feel that they need on-site pet housing, but it comes down to surveying their residents, their clients, the callers that are calling in, because in my work in this field for 31 years, I find that people with pets refuse to be separated with them. We see it in natural disasters that literally happen every day, where people stay behind facing potential death in order to caretake their pets. And domestic violence is a disaster. It's the same response. They don't want to be separated. So it's not understanding that human-animal bond. And then the last is, I also just think it comes down to the mindset of the leadership of the shelters. I have another business where I coach people on mindset, and I have a lot of coaching certifications to help them see when they're making decisions out of fear rather than empowerment. And I have found the shelters that I have worked with that have not become pet friendly is that the leadership is making decisions out of fear of not having staff, fear of not having the money, the resources, and feeling overwhelmed. And I'm not saying those aren't legit feelings, but they're working out of that. And when I ask them to give me all of their questions and concerns, and I give them solutions, that's when I notice, are they going to empower themselves and take a step forward, or are they going to continue to sit in the fear and not make this change? But it just comes down to the numbers. 66% of American homes have a pet. You do the math, and this is a big problem.
I think we had talked about this as a group earlier, but I had a family member that was in another state, and I was trying to help in a situation where she was being very, very severely injured. She was about 8 months pregnant, and she had a dog she would not leave. And there were no pet-friendly shelters in the state at the time, and no options other than taking the dog and leaving it at the Humane Society, which she was not going to do. This dog had protected her on several occasions. And so she stayed and ended up being pretty brutally beaten. And it's one of the reasons that's made me very passionate about this issue. Not that I wasn't before, because we built one of the first on-site kennels with you and your assistance. But I think that it brings up another issue of just being overwhelmed and not thinking you can add one more thing, as well as not understanding that when you find these solutions that have really strong outcomes, the money comes. We had more planned giving around our shelter than any other activity program or thing that we offered. It was like it just fell from the sky. And likewise, when we started rethinking how we were going to do not only our service delivery, but thinking about housing for survivors, we were able to go to private donors and get money that we didn't think would be available. So it was a really powerful opportunity to increase our funding when we just took that leap of faith. But it is scary. I mean, it is a scary thing. Josh and Allie, I'd love to have you weigh in as well. A lot of times, running an organization like a domestic violence shelter where you're dealing with life and death, it seems like it's always overwhelming. There's so much personal trauma. We also know that a good percentage of the staff who work in victim services in general are people who have lived experience. They come with their own personal experience, their own personal trauma sometimes as well. How do you think that might impact that idea that just adding other services or doing it differently might impact the ability to be creative or think outside the box? Josh, did you want to jump in there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, Allie makes a great point, and I think the arguments are so strong for incorporating a PETS program within your shelters. I think, for us, like we're in the process of trying to move to a different facility, and that was always a part of the planning for that. But I think when I think about sort of the resistance to it, I think fear is a really good frame. And I think, Carol, what you said as well, like the degree to which those staff are incredibly overwhelmed by the day-to-day of running a shelter. We know that somewhere on the order of, 60 to 80% of our staff likely have their own lived experience of trauma. I think it necessitates a degree of intentionality and planfulness about how you incorporate that. And I think that's what's so wise about Allie's program, is kind of providing us with a roadmap for how to do that. But I think, it sort of touches on another major issue of the work that we do. Like, how do we do this work when so many of us are in our own process of recovery and healing? And do we make sure our agencies are able to function from a place of kind of openness and intentionality around, serving our clients well, understanding the motivation behind the decisions that we make? Is it really that there's a logistical barrier, or is it just, fear, anxiety, we don't see a way forward? I think all of that is a really critical piece, and a part of our work at the Safe Center has been really incorporating a trauma-informed, a staff member who sort of held the work of ensuring that we were developing a trauma-informed culture. And so much of her work is about really identifying for the staff how to navigate those situations. And, let's be honest, staff and leadership as well. And I think that's such a critical piece of, unpacking the reality of, like, is there really a why that we're not doing this? Or is it just we've kind of made some excuses and made those excuses real? And then how do we move forward with that? What does the plan look like to move from where we are today to where we want to be? Because, again, I think the bottom line is we should all be looking at how we incorporate more of a PETS program. We know the degree to which PETS are used by batterers as leverage to keep people from leaving and to make them return if they do leave. And so all of that, if we're serious about serving victims and survivors and their families well, it's just such a critical component.
Well, and Ann Miskey, who's one of our, she's going to be moderating. She moderated the last webinar. She'll be moderating the one in November. Added in the chat that California just passed a law that said homeless shelters have to accept pets, and they fought it. But now everybody says best thing they ever did. And I don't see that wouldn't happen to domestic violence shelters in the United States. I think that we're getting to a point where even with I often use our clients that work in the homeless sector about the fact that the outcome measure is, are they still housed 1 year later? Once you house them, are they still housed 1 year later as an outcome? And we really don't have outcomes for domestic violence. We don't track them. We've got this myth that it's not safe. And in some cases it might not be, but in general, we could be tracking outcomes, and we really should be asking ourselves, is what we're doing working? Because I think there's a wealth of information out there that we're not seeing that we could be using to really ask these questions. And this is what this is. It's just a conversation starter, hoping somebody out there who's sees this webinar has some sparks. Ashley, I mean, you see so many different ways that people run shelters across the United States. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I want to actually share because I want to talk to that point of collecting data, and I wanted to actually share an example outside of the shelter space, if that's okay. Within Alliance for Hope, I'm just so impressed with their Camp Hope program, which is a summer camp / ongoing mentorship program that they offer for children who have been affected by domestic violence. So you're thinking, these are the most vulnerable. They're minors. They're people who have been experiencing domestic violence. So you would think collecting data on this would be really, really delicate and hard to kind of manage. But they've found a way. We talk a lot about the science of hope at Alliance for Hope. We can actually measure hope through a tool, a survey tool, and they measure hope throughout the camp process. So 30 days before, they measure hope, and then, I think it's the first day of camp, the last day of camp, and then 30 days after camp. So they are actually, taking the time to just simply ask, or use this tool that's defined as, measuring hope and comparing the numbers over time. So I think that you just kind of have to get creative, and understand what can you measure, and or what do you want to measure, and then start to dig into, is there a scientific way to actually measure it, and then do it, right? So create that process around how you do it. So I just think that's a great example of, a lot of people would probably think it's hard to survey and measure children, but they're doing it very, very well.
Yeah. Well, I think we also know, I know when we had and I think to Anne's point and to your point, that I think a lot of times this is funder driven. It's funder driven that we silo people, and then they get put on, they open a door, and then this is the services that you get because you have this label on your forehead. But likewise, I think funders sometimes drive the outcome measures that we then have to start living up to. And so I know we had a private funder that challenged us and said, we don't want to know what your pre and post is. We want to know what behavior change happens because you offer your DV 101. We started doing pre and post tests, but then we asked people, we said, what is it that we really want to happen because this person has sat in this class? And what we wanted was for them to be a proactive bystander. So we followed up 3 and 6 months later and found that a huge portion of the people, I can't remember the exact number, but it was like 60-70%, actually had identified someone who was a survivor and said something, and then referred them for help, which is what we were looking for. So we felt that was a really tremendous success. We also started tracking to see whether or not what else they did. And what we found was that people who had taken our training, 80% of them became donors. So that was like a double win for us as well. It helped us with deeper engagement. It helped us with our mission, but it also helped us with our fundraising. So all of that thing that, kind of goes back to tracking outcomes. But I think we have to be able to listen to what people need. And then also, as Ali, you were saying, listening on the hotline, asking, what is it that you need? Not assuming that your hotline, and I don't know how many people out there have this, but we found that our hotline was really intake for shelter, as opposed to what you're doing, Josh, or what you're recommending, Ashley, or Ashley and Ali both, is asking, what is it that you need? Not assuming. So that's a shift too. Josh, what kind of pushback did you get from staff when you started having, because I know these have been difficult conversations with some of your team,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I've come from the child abuse world. And so that in and of itself was kind of a like, well, this is different. And, we do things differently here. And so, a lot of that was sort of trying to start from a place of like, well, teach me how it's different. And kind of what Allie's articulating is like, well, is it that you want it to be different, or is it really different? Is it really a barrier, or is it something that you sort of come up with and reified by virtue of your own sort of anxiety and fear? And so, I think a lot of it is trying to articulate a vision for it for the staff. And we have exceptional staff. This is in no way to sort of diminish the staff that we have at the agency, but to try and help articulate a vision, because so many people are limited by what they've experienced or what they've seen. So trying to articulate, I know, Carol, you use the kind of Disney example a lot. I use the Nordstrom tire story a lot. Like, what does really exceptional client service look like, and how do we articulate that? And, what we found was we often were dealing with clients from a screen out perspective rather than a screen in perspective. And so people were calling us and asking for a service, and there was a like, well, we can't do that, or we can't do that. And, my orientation has always been that, and a lot of our staffs, their orientation has been, well, how do we say yes to our clients? And certainly there are boundaries around what we can do, but how do we find ways to say yes to our clients, even if that means helping them connect with another agency who may be better suited to meet their needs? And I think that was a big shift from how particularly our hotline staff have been coached, but I think our DV staff across the agency, including, what should our relationship be with our partner agencies? I think, often there can be a very adversarial relationship with local departments of social services, with law enforcement, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and many of them are very valid. But like, how do we, if our clients are interacting with these systems, it's incumbent upon us to try and figure out how to have relationships with these systems and to leverage those relationships to educate them about it is not acceptable to, tell a woman that she's got to leave her partner or she's going to lose her kid, right? And to be able to articulate, the dynamics that are at play there, and to help them understand, because I think we've found that we've had a much greater impact as an agency by virtue of working closely with those systems and recalibrating our orientation to client service than we were having when we were screening people out. And there was a lot of sort of what is a good client versus not a good client. And there's a lot to unpack there in terms of our own sort of unspoken biases and things like that. So I think it's been really interesting work, really challenging work, but I think it's been really fulfilling to see people kind of turn the corner and to be able to get a little bit more of what we're trying to articulate in terms of a really high service orientation to responding to our clients.
And Anne's put in the chat a good question, I think, about how you've incorporated survivor-led or survivor leadership, whether that's staff with lived experience or survivors that have utilized your service into your programs. And I know we did a study with a child welfare agency right around COVID, and we were looking at why they had so many children that they were removing and then placing back in the home, being removed again. And what we found was that about 80% of the women that had their children removed, when we did the danger assessment, the Jackie Campbell danger assessment, 80% of them were extremely high lethality. And just nobody had caught it. About 8% of those families had been identified as having domestic violence at all. And here we were seeing, upwards to, in the 70s and 80s, because they just weren't asking the question. And so really stepping back and incorporating the voices of those survivors in how they were doing case management and how they were offering services and how they were doing the screening was really critically important. Ashley, I mean, you got a lot of online services. How do you or Allie incorporate those voices in a very deliberate way? There's one thing to go out and do a survey. It's a whole nother thing to have it as an active, functioning part of the work that you do.
Yeah, I'll just mention two things that we do that helps us to listen and to take feedback. One is that we operate a survivors group on Facebook. So our team member, Rachel Myers, is in there all the time responding and just listening to survivors as they navigate online. And, that's the piece of the pie that we try to help people with is helping them find things online. So we're able to watch that journey and take notes and adjust our services to really meet the needs of what people need. The other piece is the Purple Ribbon Awards that I mentioned. So this national recognition program where people are submitting the best of the best programs and ideas and case studies of what has happened. So it really gives us the opportunity to open up our ears, listen to what good things are happening out there, and then share that with the field in a way that can inspire them to do amazing work, just like those Purple Ribbon Award winners.
Great, thank you. Allie, did you want to share something?
Yeah, I mean, what has been very interesting for me over the years is the safety program is it's an organization for domestic violence agencies. That is our clientele and our target audience. However, I receive daily emails from people attempting to find safe housing with their pets every day. I get the emails. That's not what we're set up for. But I just share them the link on our website and ask them to go find their nearest pet-friendly shelter, and then they have to make the call because I don't want to get into that conversation with them. I don't feel it's safe for them. But I'm seeing And I'm seeing the data just in the sheer number of people contacting me, even though point blank says on our website, please do not contact us. Here's the shelter listing. And it's taking that information, and that's what I share with the shelters is I'm hearing from your community. Are you talking to them? Because you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't ask, you're not going to know.
I do think, though, that it's something that could really be explored in a strong way, because a lot of times we talk about and I'll use the NNEV point in time count. We hear that they've been doing it for years. The data is used then to advocate for more funding and for shelters and things like that. But are we really taking that data and then stepping back and saying, wow, 7,000, or in our state, this is how many were turned away. What do we need to do with this data? And asking survivors what that means, and really having I know in a lot of the domestic violence field, they have lived experience committees that are standing committees that help give feedback about whether or not the services that we're providing are really that helpful, or whether or not we're evaluating the turnaways and whether or not it's the right client or the right fit, or we can provide the service, and maybe it's a service that's asked for a lot, and we're just not, again, collecting the data or evaluating that. So I don't know if anybody out there that's listening today, if you've got a lived experience panel, but I think it's something that we see, again, on the homeless side a lot, and even sometimes on sexual assault, but I don't see it a lot in domestic violence, particularly in design and feedback that's ongoing. So
I just wanted to add one piece that I actually forgot, a program of Alliance for Hope International, which is our Voices panel. And that is exactly what you're describing. So all family justice centers are encouraged to, allow people who have, graduated from the services at the collaborative model multi-agency centers to join a Voices committee and their communities. It's not just supporting each other as survivors, but it's enabling them to create change in their communities and be the change that they wish that they had when they were reaching out to services. So it's a great model if anyone wants to look at it. It's on under the Alliance for Hope.
And we have someone that said that they are actually on a Voices committee, so it's great. Yeah, I think having that active feedback is critically important if we really want to start to make change, and having a very deliberate feedback loop. A lot of times we don't do that as well as we should with our staff. And I know I sat down with staff before and talked about, what do we need to do to change things, and empowered them to make those changes. Again, as Josh said, on a la the Disney model, right? But still, sometimes we get so caught up in rules and regulations and policies and procedures that we sometimes forget to step back and just listen. And having that deliberate integration is really important.
I want to talk about a couple other things that I think were, the couple of challenges that have been brought up recently. Not really that recently, I guess, but I'm going to date myself a little bit. I'm a huge fan of Chris Billhart. Those people who know Chris, she ran an organization in Oregon and then really spearheaded the work that the Washington State Coalition did with the Gates Foundation, rethinking the model around how do we house people. And what they found was that if they had unallocated cash, and they were able to just ask survivors, what is it that you need? That oftentimes for as little as $1,500, they could permanently rehouse a survivor, and at 1 year, they were still rehoused. So we actually replicated this and found really we had 98% success of being housed at 1 year. It cost us around $1,500. We got a private funder to give us money for this. And it was amazing because the things that we normally would have provided, that wasn't what they needed. And so I would sit there at my desk some days and I get these check requests for getting a car out of that had been impounded, or paying for somebody's 1 month of daycare, or paying for someone to get their commercial driver's license so that they could become a bus driver again. And so we just were allowed staff to be really creative. And it was amazing the success we were able to have. And what Chris found was that they were actually able to cut shelters down in Oregon because they were able to house women without having to come into shelter. Shelter is so important. I want to make sure that everybody, knows that I feel very, very passionate about the need for emergency shelter, but it is not, as Chris says, it should be a verb and not a noun. And it is not the end all and be all. And unfortunately, I think what happens and what we found when we did our study in Miami is that child welfare and a lot of the systems think that shelter, we got her into shelter and so everything's solved. And then when you find the research that says that 25% of them are successful and 75% aren't, then that really becomes a challenge for are we really being successful? So I don't know if you've not seen Chris's the research done out of the Washington State Coalition with housing. It's really wonderful. Like I said, we replicated it, and tremendous success with it. But it really was based on listening to survivors. And I think the other thing I want to bring up to the panel, kind of as last thoughts that have you weigh in on both of those, is Louise Snyder had a New York Times op-ed that talked about the really idea of hiding the shelter, that needs to be hidden. And that in this day and age, with being able to track things, that the only people who can't find it are the survivors, and that really starting to rethink this idea of maybe making domestic violence shelters secure, but seen and visible so that survivors know where to go. And the idea of that. So I want to toss both of those out to you about just, some innovative and kind of maybe uncomfortable ideas that people have had. And what are some things that, as we take ideas and questions from the group, what are some other ways that listening to survivors and really starting to rethink how we do business as a movement that you want to add?
I just wanted to say thank you for bringing up the idea of kind of those micro grants of how impactful that is. We've seen that in specifically one of the Purple Ribbon Award winners, Control Alt Delete out of Arizona. That is just an amazing model. And I just want to kind of say, I think people should definitely look at it, because it is just those little things. It's the $50 bus ticket. It's the, something that they need to get from point A to point B. That's a barrier to them. But unless we give them, we're not going to be able to package and hand that to them without asking. They need to tell us.
Well, and what we were able to do with donors is show that the cost to keep someone in shelter for a week, especially if the average size family that we were serving, versus the one-time micro grant or funds that we were giving them, that return on investment was incredible. And donors were more than willing to write checks for that. And survivors loved it, and because it was helping them get what they needed as opposed to what we assumed they need, which was to have to come into shelter. To Josh's point, to have them do something that they may or may not be able to even do because they couldn't bring their pet or their 13-year-old son or whatever the case might be. Josh, any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've implemented in New York State, there's been some funding that was allocated through our Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence for sort of low barrier funding. And I think it was really well intentioned. I think it was I think it needed more structure, but I think we saw it very clearly with our clients, the significant impact of just being able to access some funding for just concrete needs and bills and things. So I think that was really valuable. I did want to respond to the shelter piece because I think it's, it feels like a continuation of what Allie raised previously around having pets in the shelter. I think there's this question of where things are a safety issue versus where things are a comfort issue. And I think, one of the questions we're wrestling with right now, and certainly don't pretend to have a final answer, is if we have an incredibly safe shelter that nobody knows about and a small percentage of people are accessing, is that the best model versus a shelter where more people are going to be able to know about it and access it and sort of be able to get a modicum of safety? I think there's this balance that we have to find. And, a lot of it, what we're encountering in the conversation is what Allie talked about with pets, where it's just this sort of people are having a very visceral reaction to the idea of making a shift and having a shelter that's less secret. And, again, we have to be very careful about how we navigate that conversation. And, but I think there's a piece that's very similar to really looking at who are we serving? I think one of the things I've been a big advocate of us looking at is who are we not serving because of the way our programs and services are structured. And is that something that is a positive, a net positive or a net negative, right? We know we're not going to serve everybody in our community, but if we're not serving people because they don't know that a domestic violence shelter exists and we're having domestic violence homicides in our community, that's a question we have to wrestle with. And I think we have to challenge ourselves to say, to what degree can we open our barriers a little bit to accessing the shelter, in service of more people getting safe housing.
Yeah, and I think and I know you're also struggling with size. Do we just increase size? Is the solution getting a bigger shelter and a bigger shelter and a bigger shelter, which is incredibly expensive with the cost of real estate these days, or is it coming up with other solutions? And I know your organization is really struggling with that right now because you're in Long Island, which, real estate is incredibly expensive and there's not a lot of it. Allie, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, the one frustration that I have is when shelters have a website and they have a social media presence, but they will not share that they can take pets on site. And when I ask them, hey, is there a reason that you don't have this on your website? Because that's usually where survivors are going first. They're looking. They know how to use the search bar and they're typing in the word pet and animal and nothing is coming up. And I continuously hear, well, we don't want to put that information out publicly. Well, then how are they going to know that you're doing that? So, we have our website, that's pretty high up, on the search rankings, but why are we hiding that? So it kind of comes back to the question, why, is this a good thing that we are basically in hiding? But at the end of the day, there's too many survivors who cannot find the locations that they need. And I hear back from them when I send them the shelter listing, they reply back and say, I didn't even know that I had a shelter in my community, let alone one that was pet friendly. So it's shifting out of that thinking from decades ago that just doesn't work now, because everything has really shifted, and pet ownership and pets being part of the family. And we just have to get shelters to really rethink how they're offering services because everything's dramatically changed. And so we have to change with it.
I think it's an opportunity. If our presenters want to put their contact information in the chat, that would be great. We'll be sending out, if you have any other questions and you want to contact me or any of the presenters, feel free to do that. Hopefully today we were able to get people just to have some ideas around this idea of barriers. And are we really listening to survivors? We will be sending out probably tomorrow the first video so you can learn more about engaging those voices and how to deliberately put voices of survivors and those with lived experience into your program design and into your leadership in a very meaningful way, but also thinking about the barriers that we're putting up that we may not even realize are there. And then what are those myths that we're retelling? And my challenge to you is don't ever repeat the 1 in 7 again, because we all know that there is no basis in reality for that. So let's start building a wealth of research and data that is real. And let's talk about what's really happening out there. Because there's so many people that need the help, and you all are a lifeline for so many in this country that otherwise would be facing a horrible fate. So I appreciate everybody who's on the call today. I appreciate all of our speakers, Allie, Ashley, Josh, for being here today. And just thank you so much. I really appreciate the work that everyone's doing, especially during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, out there raising awareness. If there's any ideas that you want to run past us, like I said, we're always out and available. I just really appreciate the opportunity for us to help maybe jog some thoughts in people's minds about this issue. Allie, Ashley, Josh, one last word that you'd like to share?
Thank you. Thank you for doing this. This is wonderful.
Yeah, thanks for starting our conversation.
Thank you. And I hope everybody joins us in November. I think that even if you're just running a domestic violence shelter, it will be amazing to hear from people who have taken literally the myth that homeless people who are chronically homeless don't want to come in shelter, busted that completely up, and now have the ability to clear out encampments and really break through barriers of reasons by people saying that the people aren't getting help, and designing programs with those voices and really debunking all of those myths. So we hope you'll follow through with the last part of our series. And again, thank you for joining us today.